They tore down my porch while I was at work. No call, no warning, not even the courtesy of knocking on my door. By the time I got home, all that was left was a pile of splintered wood and a strip of bright orange tape flapping in the wind like some kind of cheap apology. And standing there, staring at what used to be the quietest, most personal corner of my life, I realized something real clear. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a decision. And decisions have consequences. See, that porch wasn't just lumber and nails. It wasn't some weekend project I threw together because I got bored one summer. That thing had history baked into every inch of it. Summer of '96, me and my dad built it together. Just the two of us. No contractors, no fancy tools, just sweat, bad measurements, and a lot of arguing over whether a board was straight or close enough. He used to whistle while he worked, some old country tune he never finished, and every now and then he'd stop, lean on the railing we hadn't even finished yet, and hand me a glass of lemonade like we had all the time in the world. It wasn't perfect. Hell, if you looked close enough, nothing lined up exactly right. The handrails were made from reclaimed barnwood we hauled out of a collapsed shed 2 towns over, and the swing, that old porch swing, creaked like it had secrets. But it was ours. That's what mattered. Every nail in that thing had a memory attached to it. I drank my morning coffee out there for almost 3 decades. Watched storms roll in across the horizon, slow and heavy, like they had somewhere important to be. When my daughter Lily was a baby, that porch was the only place she'd fall asleep without screaming. I'd rock her gently, listening to that same creak in the swing, thinking maybe one day she'd remember this place the way I did. And then one Thursday, it was just gone. I remember pulling into the driveway and thinking something looked off. You know that feeling, when your brain notices something before you consciously do. I stepped out of the truck, shut the door, and just stood there for a second, trying to figure out what didn't belong. And then it hit me, or rather, what didn't hit me. The porch, it wasn't there. Just gone. In its place was a mess of broken boards, twisted nails, and that stupid orange tape stretched across like a crime scene. There was a paper taped to my front door, half peeling off already. I walked up, pulled it loose, and read it once. Then again, slower this time, like maybe the words would change if I gave them enough time. Structure removed per HOA violation 4.17. Unauthorized modification. Non-compliant with community aesthetic standards. Unauthorized. That word stuck in my head like a splinter. That porch had been standing there for almost 30 years, longer than most of the houses in that neighborhood, longer than the HOA itself. When I bought the place, there wasn't even a homeowners association yet. Just people minding their own business, mowing their lawns, waving when you passed by. But things change. People move in, rules follow, and suddenly you've got a committee deciding what color your mailbox should be. I stood there for a long time, just holding that paper, feeling something between disbelief and anger, like my brain hadn't decided which one to settle on yet. Eventually, I walked over to what was left of the porch and crouched down, picking up a piece of wood, one of the old beams my dad and I had sanded by hand. It was split clean down the middle. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about rules. Someone had made the call to destroy something that meant something to me, without even giving me the chance to defend it. I went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and read the notice again. There was a fine listed at the bottom, daily penalties if I didn't bring the property into compliance, which was funny considering they'd already removed the supposed problem themselves. I called the number on the notice. Straight to voicemail. Left a message. Calm, polite. Asked for clarification. No response. The next morning, I drove over to the HOA office, small building near the entrance of the neighborhood, fake brick, flag out front, the kind of place that tries real hard to look official without actually being important. Inside, there was a receptionist who barely looked up from her computer. "I'm here about a violation notice," I said, setting the paper on the counter. She glanced at it, clicked around on her screen, and said, "You'll need to submit a formal request if you want to dispute the action." "I'm not disputing it," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm asking why my property was demolished without notice." She gave me that look. You know the one, polite on the surface, but already done with the conversation. Notices were sent out in accordance with HOA policy. I didn't receive anything. They were sent. She repeated, like that settled it. I stood there for a second, just staring at her, waiting for some kind of human response, something that acknowledged what had actually happened. But there wasn't any. Just policy. Procedure. Paperwork. Can I speak to someone on the board? I asked. They're not available without an appointment. Then I'd like to make one. Next available is in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd it felt like a joke. All right, I said, picking up the notice, schedule it. As I turned to leave, she added, in the meantime, continued noncompliance may result in additional fines. I stopped at the door, hand on the handle, and just shook my head a little. Yeah, I said quietly, more to myself than to her. We'll see about that. Because here's the thing they didn't know, and probably should have checked before they decided to tear into someone's property like they owned it. I'm not just some guy with a porch. I'm a licensed structural engineer, and for about 6 years, I worked with the county zoning commission, which means I know exactly how this kind of system works. And more importantly, I know where it breaks. I went home that afternoon, sat down at my desk, and pulled up the HOA bylaws, all 92 pages of it. Dense, repetitive, written in that kind of language that makes simple things sound complicated on purpose. Most people would have skimmed it, maybe looked for keywords, but I didn't. I read every single line. Because if there's one thing I learned working zoning, it's that the rules people use to control you are usually the same rules that can be used against them. And somewhere in that document, I knew there was going to be something they overlooked. Something small, something technical, something they assumed no one would ever notice. So I kept reading page after page until I found it. And when I did, I just leaned back in my chair, smiled a little, and said out loud, well, that's interesting. Now, I didn't find it right away. It wasn't sitting there bolded or underlined like some kind of gift. No, it was buried, halfway down page 68, tucked between sections about landscaping guidelines and fence height restrictions, the kind of place nobody reads unless they have a reason to. Section July 3rd, 11. All structural modifications, additions, or removals authorized by the HOA must be reviewed and approved by a licensed professional and must comply with all applicable county and state permitting requirements prior to execution. I read that line 3 times, slow, deliberate, letting each word settle. Authorized by the HOA. Must be reviewed. Must comply. Prior to execution. And just like that, the whole situation flipped in my head. Because they hadn't just removed my porch, they'd authorized a structural demolition. And unless they had a licensed engineer sign off on it, plus proper permits filed through the county, they weren't just bending the rules. They were violating their own. I remember leaning back in my chair, hands behind my head, staring at the ceiling fan spinning above me. And for the first time since I saw that pile of broken wood in my yard, I felt calm. Not because things were fixed, but because now I understood something they didn't. This wasn't personal for them. It was routine, procedure, checklist, sign, move on. But for me, now it was personal. The next morning, I made a few calls, not angry calls, not confrontational, just quiet, professional conversations with people I used to work with. You'd be surprised how many folks stay in the same departments for years, zoning, permitting, inspections. It's a small world if you've been in it long enough. Hey, this is Daniel Mercer. Yeah, it's been a while. Listen, quick question for you. I kept it casual, asked about recent permit activity in my neighborhood, specifically anything tied to the HOA. There was a pause on the other end of the line, keyboard clicking, then a soft chuckle. That's odd, the guy said. I'm not seeing much of anything filed under their name. Nothing, I asked. Couple minor electrical permits from last year. But structural? No, not recently. I thanked him, hung up, and just sat there for a second, letting that sink in. Because I already knew they'd been busy. In the past year alone, they'd built a new gazebo by the lake, upgraded the lighting system around the tennis courts, installed those oversized brick pillars at the entrance that everyone complained about, but nobody asked for. All of it structural changes. All of it requiring permits. And according to the system, none of it existed. That's when the plan started forming, not all at once, not some grand scheme, just a series of small, logical steps, each one leading naturally to the next. I wasn't going to argue with them. I wasn't going to yell or threaten or demand anything. I was just going to follow the rules, exactly the way they were written. I started by filing a formal inquiry with the county, requesting verification of permits for specific HOA-managed structures. Nothing aggressive, just a request for documentation. That alone was enough to trigger a review process. Then I filed a second request, this one a little more pointed, questioning compliance with environmental and safety regulations for shared community amenities. Again, all by the book. No accusations. Just questions. But questions, in the right system, create movement. Within a week, I got my first response, a notice confirming that several listed structures could not be verified as properly permitted and would be scheduled for inspection. I remember reading that email and feeling something settle in my chest. Not excitement, not revenge, just balance. Like a scale that had been tipped was finally starting to move back the other way. And then, things started happening. Slow at first. A county truck parked near the lake one afternoon. 2 inspectors walking around the gazebo, taking notes, measuring supports. A few days later, another team showed up at the tennis courts, checking wiring, opening panels, asking questions nobody in the HOA office seemed prepared to answer. Neighbors started noticing. You'd hear it in passing conversations, at mailboxes, on sidewalks, people lowering their voices just a little. Did you see those inspectors by the gym? I heard they're checking permits. Something about code violations. I didn't say anything, just nodded when people talked. Kept my routine the same. Morning coffee inside now. Since the porch was gone, work, home, quiet evenings. But behind the scenes, I kept filing. Zoning compliance. ADA accessibility for shared facilities. Drainage concerns near the playground. Each request small on its own, reasonable, justified. Together, they created pressure. About 3 weeks in, the orange tape came back. Only this time, it wasn't on my property. I was driving home when I saw it stretched across the entrance to the community gym, bright, unmistakable, blocking the doors. A notice posted right in the center. Stop work order, pending inspection. I slowed down as I passed, taking it in, not with satisfaction exactly, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement. That didn't take long. A couple days later, the playground got flagged, something about the rubber mulch not meeting required depth for fall protection. Then the pool, temporary closure due to compliance review. One by one, the amenities that made the neighborhood feel polished, controlled, started unraveling. And the HOA? They scrambled. Emails started going out, long, carefully worded messages trying to explain what was happening without actually saying anything. Routine inspections, they called it. Proactive compliance measures. But people weren't buying it. Because inconvenience has a way of cutting through polished language real quick. Kids couldn't use the playground. Residents couldn't access the gym they were paying for. The pool, closed in the middle of a heat wave. That's when the tone shifted. I got my first direct contact from the board about a month after my porch was torn down. An email, short, to the point. Mr. Mercer, we've received multiple inquiries regarding recent county inspections. We would like to schedule a meeting to discuss ongoing concerns. I stared at that message for a second, then let out a quiet breath through my nose. 3 weeks for an appointment, right? I replied about 10 minutes later. Next available time for me is in 3 weeks. Petty? Maybe. But I wasn't in a hurry anymore. By the time that meeting rolled around, the situation had escalated beyond what I think any of them expected. There were now multiple open cases with the county, some minor, some not so minor, all requiring documentation they didn't seem to have. I walked into that HOA office again, same building, same receptionist, though this time she looked up a little quicker when I came in. There was tension in the air, subtle, but there. They had me sit in a small conference room. A few minutes later, the board members filed in, 3 of them, and then her. Linda Carver, HOA president. Late 50s, sharp posture, the kind of expression that's practiced, controlled, like she's used to being the one in charge of the room. I'd seen her before, mostly at a distance, community meetings, holiday events, always composed, always polite in that way that doesn't invite conversation. She sat down across from me, folded her hands on the table, and gave a thin smile. Mr. Mercer, she said, thank you for coming. I nodded. You wanted to talk. She glanced briefly at the others, then back at me. We're concerned about the recent attention our community has received from county officials. Are you? I said, calm, neutral. Her smile tightened just a fraction. We've reason to believe these inspections were prompted by formal complaints. Requests, I corrected gently. For verification. One of the other board members shifted in his seat. Linda didn't look away from me. And these requests, she continued, wouldn't happen to be connected to your situation? There it was. Not an accusation, but close enough. I leaned back slightly in my chair, considering her for a moment. You removed a structure from my property, I said, voice even. Without prior notice, without my consent, and as far as I can tell, without proper permitting. That structure was in violation of community standards, she replied quickly. Maybe, I said, tilting my head a little. But according to your own bylaws, any structural action authorized by the HOA requires licensed review and county permits prior to execution. Silence. Just for a second, but it was enough. I watched it land. The subtle shift in posture, the quick glance between board members, the realization. Linda's expression didn't change much, but her voice, it lost a bit of that practiced smoothness. We operate within our authority, she said. I'm sure you believe that, I replied. Another pause. Then she leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. You've made your point, Mr. Mercer. I held her gaze. I don't think I have, I said quietly. And for the first time since I walked into that room. She didn't have an immediate response. She just sat there for a second, like she was trying to decide whether to push harder or pull back, and that moment, that little crack in the control she'd been holding on to, told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't how things usually went for her. People didn't push back. They complied, they paid fines, they adjusted their mailbox colors and trimmed their hedges to regulation height. They didn't walk into a room and calmly explain exactly where the system was broken. I think, she said finally, choosing her words carefully, it would be in everyone's best interest to resolve this efficiently. There was something almost diplomatic about the way she said it, like we were negotiating a trade deal instead of talking about the fact that her board had bulldozed part of my life. Efficient would have been a phone call, I said, not raising my voice, not leaning forward, just letting it sit there between us. One of the other board members cleared his throat, shifted again, clearly wishing he was somewhere else. Linda didn't look at him. What is it you want? She asked. Now that was the question, wasn't it? Because up until that point, I hadn't really framed it that way. I wasn't doing this for a payout. I wasn't trying to win something tangible. I just refused to let what they did pass like it was normal. So I took a second, let the silence stretch just enough to make it real. I want accountability, I said. Not an email, not a statement. I want it on record that what was done to my property violated your own procedures. Her jaw tightened, just slightly. And after that? She asked. I shrugged a little. After that, we'll see. That wasn't the answer she wanted. You could tell. She wanted something she could agree to, something she could contain. But this wasn't contained anymore. This had already spilled out into something bigger. The meeting ended not long after that. No resolution, no handshake, just a quiet understanding that things weren't going back to the way they were. And they didn't. Over the next couple months, everything escalated, not in one big, dramatic explosion, but in a steady, relentless way that was honestly more exhausting for them than anything else. The county inspections kept coming. Each one uncovered something new, missing documentation, outdated compliance, things that had been overlooked or ignored because no one had ever really checked. And once that door was open, it didn't close easily. The big shift came when one of my filings triggered a classification review. Now, this is where my background really mattered, because most people wouldn't even think to look at something like that. But I did. See, the HOA wasn't just maintaining shared spaces, they were collecting dues, managing facilities, providing amenities. And under certain conditions, that can blur the line between a residential association and something closer to a managed development entity. So I filed a request. Just a review, asking the county to evaluate whether the community's operations met criteria for a different classification, one that carried stricter oversight, more requirements, more accountability. I didn't expect it to go through, but it did. Not fully, not permanently, but enough to trigger a temporary reassessment. And that changed everything. Suddenly, things that had been minor issues became major ones. Documentation had to be updated. Inspections became more frequent, more detailed. Insurance providers started asking questions. Costs went up. And the residents? They were done being patient. The newsletters stopped sounding polished. You could feel the shift in tone, frustration creeping in, questions getting more direct. Why are we paying higher dues? Why are facilities still closed? What is the board doing about this? At first, the board tried to manage it. More emails, more explanations, more carefully worded updates. But eventually, people stopped listening. I remember one evening, maybe 6 months after everything started, I was out in the yard, no porch still, just a temporary set of steps leading up to the front door. I was sanding down a new beam, working slow, taking my time, not rushing it. And I saw her walking up the driveway. Linda. No entourage this time. No board members. Just her. She stopped a few feet away, arms crossed, looking at the space where the porch used to be, then at the new materials stacked nearby. "You're rebuilding it," she said. "Yeah," I replied, not looking up right away. "With permits this time." There was a pause. "You've caused a lot of disruption," she said. I set the sandpaper down, brushed my hands off, and finally looked at her. "I didn't start this," I said. She let out a short breath, something between a sigh and frustration. "No," she admitted, "but you didn't have to take it this far." I tilted my head a little. "How far is this far?" She didn't answer that. Instead, she looked around at the yard, the materials, the quiet, and for a second, she didn't look like the president of anything. Just tired. "The board is under pressure," she said. "People are talking about dissolving it." I nodded once. That tends to happen when trust breaks. She studied me for a moment, like she was trying to figure out if there was any room left to negotiate. "What would it take," she asked, "for you to stop?" And there it was again, that question. Only now, it felt different. Because at this point, it wasn't really about stopping or continuing. The system was already moving. Files had been opened, processes triggered. You don't just flip a switch and make that disappear. But still, I thought about it. "Not for long." "I already told you," I said. "Accountability." She shook her head slightly. "You got that. The inspections, the reviews, we're dealing with it." "That's not accountability," I said quietly. "That's consequence." That one landed harder than anything else I'd said. She didn't argue, didn't push back, just stood there for a second, then gave a small nod, like she understood something she hadn't wanted to before. And then she left. A few weeks after that, the board announced a formal resignation. Not all at once, staggered, one by one, but the result was the same. New people stepped in, quieter, less interested in control, more focused on fixing what had been broken. The classification review eventually settled back into standard residential status, but not before forcing a complete overhaul of how things were managed. Permits were filed properly. Inspections were scheduled regularly. Policies were rewritten. And me? I rebuilt the porch. Took longer this time. Not because I didn't know how, but because I wanted to do it right. Wider than before, stronger. Added a new swing, quieter, but still with that familiar rhythm. Even put in a small hot tub off to the side. Figured if I was going to go through all that trouble, I might as well enjoy it. The first morning I sat out there again, coffee in hand, sun just coming up, it felt different. Not better, not worse. Just earned. Like the space meant something new now. Lily came by later that week. She's older now, doesn't need rocking to sleep anymore. But she sat on that swing with me for a while, listening to it move, back and forth, back and forth. "Looks nice," she said. "Yeah," I replied. "It does." We didn't talk about everything that happened. Didn't need to. Because some things, they settle on their own. Now, last I heard, Linda moved out. Condo across town. No HOA. I don't know if that was because of all this, or just timing. But I do know this. Communities like that, they only work when there's a line. Between guidance and control. Between structure and overreach. And once that line gets crossed, well, sometimes it takes a lot more than a complaint to draw it back. So here's the thing I've been thinking about lately, and I'm curious what you think. Was I justified? Or did I go too far? Because yeah, they tore down my porch. But I didn't just rebuild it. I changed the entire system around it. And not everyone walked away from that untouched. So if you were in my position, what would you have done? Let it go, or do exactly what I did? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read more of them than you'd think. And if you've ever dealt with something like this, neighbors, HOAs, anyone who thought they had more control than they should, go ahead and share that too. I've got a feeling this isn't one of those stories that only happens once.